The letter arrived on an ordinary afternoon, folded stiff and official with dust from the road still clinging to its edge. Cora Whitfield stood behind the counter of her bakery with flour on her wrists and heat rising from the ovens in slow, wavering breaths. Outside, wagon wheels rolled over hard-packed earth. A mule brayed somewhere up the street. Somebody laughed near the well. Inside her shop, the air smelled of yeast cinnamon and the last sweet tray of raisin bread cooling by the window. She broke the seal with a thumb still dusted white and began to read. By the second line, her throat had gone tight. By the third, the room felt smaller. By the fourth, she read it again because the words were too ugly to belong to the world she knew. Under territorial property regulation, unmarried women above a certain age were no longer permitted to hold independent commercial title. Compliance was required within 60 days. Ownership would otherwise be surrendered and reassigned. 60 days. Cora lowered the paper slowly. Her hands shook once hard, then went still. The bakery had belonged to her father before it belonged to her. The counters were scarred where he had chopped walnuts with the flat of his blade. The left oven door never shut quite true because he had fixed the hinge one winter with an old horseshoe nail and a prayer. The back shelf still carried faint brown rings from the coffee cups he used to set there every morning before dawn. When fever took him, then took her younger brother 3 nights later, the bakery had fallen silent. Then Cora had brought it back to life. She had kneaded dough with swollen hands, burned loaves, broken down crying in the dark beside cooling racks no one would buy from if she failed. She had rebuilt the place one batch at a time until the town began to trust her bread as much as they once trusted her father's. Now some man in an office she had never seen had decided it was not hers after all. She crushed the letter in her fist. "Bastards," she whispered. The bell over the door jingled. Margot Bell stepped in with wind on her skirt hem and a sharp look already forming in her eyes.
We can't change
That bad, Cora threw the letter onto the counter, read it. Margot unfolded it, her expression darkened by degrees. "I got one too." Cora stared. For the boarding house, Margot nodded once. Apparently, a woman without a husband is a danger to ownership, decency, and civilization. The words might have been funny on another day. Instead, they landed like grit between the teeth. Cora braced both palms on the counter. They cannot do this. They already did. The ovens ticked as the heat settled in the iron. Beyond the front window, a boy ran past trailing a stick in the dust. Main Street looked exactly the same. That made it worse. The world had not even paused for the ruin of hers. "What will you do?" Cora asked. Margot gave a bitter half laugh. "Marry a saint. Poison him quietly, bury him with honors." Cora almost smiled, but it did not hold. "I'm not marrying some fool just to keep what I built." Margot folded the letter carefully. "Then the law will take it. That sentence lodged deep. Not lose it, not sell it, not fail it. The law will take it." After Margot left, the bakery seemed louder in its silence. The crackle of cooling crust, the rustle of flour sacks, the wind worrying the loose edge of the sign outside. Cora went into the back room and sat on the narrow cot beneath the window. She stared at the little washstand, at the extra apron hanging from the peg, at the recipe book her father had written in neat, dark ink. She had seen what marriage did to women in towns like this. It wore them down, bent their backs, took their names and their say-so, and then called it protection. Her mother had gone from laughter to hollow eyes in 10 years of childbirth and burying babies. Cora had watched it happen. She had decided young that if life meant kneeling under someone else's hand, then she would rather stand alone. But standing alone, it seemed, had now become illegal. By sunset, the sky outside the back window had gone copper, then bruise purple. Cora had not moved. Then just after dark, shouting broke the stillness. She was on her feet in an instant. Orange light flashed against the glass. Fire. She ran barefoot into the street shawl half thrown over her shoulders. The blacksmith shop at the edge of town was breathing flame through the forge awning. Men shouted for water. Women formed a line. Buckets flew hand to hand. Steam hissed. Smoke rolled low and black. Cora joined the line without thought, cold water slapping over her wrists, soot stinging her eyes. When at last the flames died down, the townsfolk drifted away in clumps, muttering about luck and damage and close calls. Only one man remained near the smoking wreck. Chayton Crow stood in the ash-dark doorway with firelight painting the hard planes of his face. He was broad-shouldered, still as a post, his shirt dark with sweat and smoke. His hands were blistered. One side of his jaw held an old scar pale against his skin. He looked at the ruined awning as if he could hold the whole place together by standing there. Cora had spoken to him only in passing before. The town called him quiet. Some called him worse things when they thought he could not hear. But everybody brought their broken hinges, wagon rims, stove doors, and horseshoes to the smithy because Chaitin was the one who truly kept it alive. She took one look at him in the smoke and ruin, and something cold and desperate began to form in her mind. 60 days, a bakery and a smithy. Two people the law had decided could not keep what they had built. By the time she turned back toward home, her heart was pounding for a reason that had nothing to do with the fire. 3 days passed like a hand around Cora's throat. She baked more than the town could eat, kneaded dough until her shoulders ached, smiled at customers and did not hear half what they said. Every time the bakery door opened, she looked up hoping and dreading in equal measure.
I understand.
On the third evening, just
Name
before
them.
closing, she saw him through the front
No
window.
questions,
Chaitin crossed
no
the street
delays.
with the same measured stride he always had, though one leg
Safety,
favored an old
that's
injury
all.
when he thought no one was looking.
These are the
He
terms.
came in without removing his
We
hat,
work the
then
land
closed the door
together.
behind him and turned the sign to
Together
closed.
in the harvest.
Cora wiped her palms on her
Split it
apron.
evenly.
Well,
I handle
his
the
gaze
heavy
settled on
work.
her steady and
I
unreadable.
can manage.
I have conditions.
accept.
Her breath left her in a
Good, we
rush.
started,
So that means yes. It means I listened.
Why did you
She
agree
folded her
to
arms
this?
mostly to stop herself from reaching for the counter,
Because I
then
gave
say
my
them.
word to
He
protect
stepped
you.
farther inside. The fading
And
light
I
from the
keep
window
my
caught the
word.
soot still trapped at the edge of one
But
knuckle.
why me?
We tell people we've been seeing
is
each
a
other for a
question
while,
for another
quietly. Fine.
The
We
owner
live at my
can't
place.
keep up.
It is bigger and it will look
His
more
nephew
natural.
from back
She did
east
not
wants
like
to
the thought of
sell.
leaving the room behind the
Sell?
bakery, but he was
After
right.
everything
All
we've
right,
built here?
separate rooms.
He's not
That was
taking
already
his
my
place.
thought. When the
Not
60
from
days are
us.
done, we end it
We're in
clean.
this
No
fight
debts, no
together.
confusion. Cora lifted her
We
chin.
both
That is the
know
arrangement.
This marriage
He
is
nodded
only
once but
for
did
the
not move.
property.
The silence stretched. At last
No,
she said,
It's
"Why
for
did you say yes?"
survival.
His
That
mouth
is
hardened a
the
fraction.
truth.
The smithy owner has a nephew coming from back east.
For
The old man is
survival.
failing. If nothing changes, the nephew inherits and
We
sells the
should
place the
invent
minute
our
he can count the
courtship
tools. I built
for
most
them.
of what keeps that
A
shop
walk
standing.
by the river.
I will not watch some soft-handed
At
stranger
sunset.
strip it for parts.
Yes.
Cora knew
talked
enough of the
for
story to
hours.
understand. Chaitin did
And I
most of the
gave you
labor.
a flower.
The owner did most of the drinking. Everybody in town knew it.
We'll
So we are
say
both
the oven
marrying for
grates are
property, she
broken.
said, for
That
survival.
explains
The
our
word hung there
talks.
between them,
A
plain and
believable
unsentimental.
story. It protects us
Cora drew a
both.
breath.
Yes.
We should decide on names, dates,
No one will
details.
suspect.
We met at market. We started
We
speaking over
understand
flour
each other.
sacks and iron orders. We kept it quiet because we do not like town gossip. A flicker of something touched his eyes. Maybe approval. That will do. They began building a story the way people on the frontier built anything that had to stand in bad weather, piece by piece, practical first. They decided he had begun bringing broken oven
plan
grates to
is
her
set.
back door and stayed to talk.
Are you
That
ready?
she admired how he worked
I
with
am,
metal, that he liked the
I'm
way she did not
scared.
flinch from hard labor,
I won't let
that their courtship had
anything
been brief,
happen to
private,
you.
and no one's concern. None of it was entirely
trust
true.
you.
None of it was entirely false either. When they finished, dusk had settled soft and blue along the street. Tomorrow, he said. The clerk's office. Cora swallowed. That fast? You have fewer than 60 days now. Delay helps no one. He turned for the door. Chaitin. He stopped. Cora hesitated. The next words felt strange in her mouth. I do not know how to do this. He looked back at her. Outside, wind moved dust in a low sweep past the window. Somewhere a hammer rang once from down the road and fell silent. You know how to keep a place alive when it should have died, he said. So do I. Start there. Then he walked out. The next morning arrived hard and grey. Cora wore her only good dress, deep brown with small black buttons that her father had once said made her look too stern to be 26. She braided her hair twice before her fingers stopped trembling enough to pin it. When she stepped into the street, Chaitin was already waiting outside the territorial office. He had cleaned up. Fresh shirt. Boots brushed, dark hair tied back neatly. He looked as out of place in formal clothes as a wolf behind a fence. Ready, he asked. No, she said. Neither am I. That at least felt honest. Inside, the marriage clerk had ink-stained fingers and the bored face of a man who had watched too many people sign away their futures to be impressed by another pair. He asked their names, wrote them down, asked the purpose of marriage in a flat voice that made Cora's stomach twist. Personal, Chaitin said before she could answer. The clerk barely looked up. The vows were thin legal bones with no flesh of tenderness on them. Cora repeated the words because she had to. Chayton did the same. No rings, no flowers, no family witnesses, only ink paper and necessity. When the signatures were done, the clerk shuffled the documents and said, "You are married." That was all. No thunder, no choir, no warning from heaven, just a sentence. Outside, the morning wind lifted the hem of Cora's dress. She stood on the wooden steps and stared at the street. Wife. The word felt borrowed. Chayton tucked the papers into his coat. "I will clear space tonight." Cora looked at him, at the man who was now tied to her by law and strategy and fear. This is madness. Yes, and it might fail. Yes. She let out a breath that shook. Good. I was worried only one of us had any sense. For the first time, the corner of his mouth moved. Not enough for a smile, but enough to make one possible. Then they walked in opposite directions to keep their businesses open, carrying the same secret into the same town under two separate skies. News moved through Cold Creek faster than wildfire in grass. By the time Cora finished her noon batch of bread, 3 women had come in to buy biscuits they did not need and ask questions they pretended not to be asking. When did it happen? How long had it been going on? Why had she kept it quiet? And beneath every soft voice and smiling mouth was the same harder thing. Why him? Cora answered with a level face and a careful story. A few months, quietly. We are private people. It felt like feeding strangers crumbs while they peered through the windows of her life. That evening after closing, she packed everything that truly mattered into 2 crates. Dresses, aprons, her father's recipe book, a tin box with a few saved letters, her mother's hair comb with 3 teeth missing, a folded quilt, 2 plates she liked better than the others because they matched, though neither was whole. That was the miserable truth of a hard life. When the time came, a whole home could be lifted in 2 crates and 1 aching armload. She carried them down the street at sunset. The smithy sat near the end of town where the road turned rough and the wind always seemed a little meaner. The house attached to it was plain square and sturdier than most. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, dark line. Chayton opened the door before she knocked twice. He took 1 crate without a word and stepped aside. The house was cleaner than she expected. Spare but orderly. A table, 2 chairs, iron hooks by the door, shelves built with skill instead of hurry. The air smelled of wood smoke, lamp oil, and metal cooled after heat. "That room is yours," he said, nodding to a door on the left. "Mine is at the end of the hall." Cora carried her crate in and looked around. A narrow bed, a dresser rubbed smooth by years of use, a wash basin, a small window that looked toward the alley behind the smithy. On the dresser sat a lamp already lit. He had thought to leave her light. When she came back to the kitchen, he was stirring a pot on the stove. "You cook?" she asked. "I keep myself alive. That is not always the same thing." His eyes met hers briefly. "I have heard that said about my coffee." Despite herself, Cora let out a short breath that almost became laughter. They ate stew at the table while dusk thickened beyond the windows. The spoons made small sounds in the bowls. The stove clicked softly as the heat shifted. Outside, the wind pushed against the wall in dry, sweeping breaths. It was not home, not yet. But it was not hostile either. Afterward, Cora washed dishes while Chayton stacked wood by the stove. "We need rules," she said. "Go on. Knock before entering my room." "I will. You do not get to order me about in my own work. I would not try. You do not expect me to cook because I am a woman." He glanced at her over the wood in his arms. "Then do not expect me to mend every hinge in town for free because I am handy." She looked at him. "That is fair." He set down the last piece of wood. Anything else, Cora dried her hands on a towel. "If people ask how we met, we tell it the same way every time. We met over broken oven grates and market errands. We admired each other's work. We kept it quiet, because the town talks too much." That almost smile touched his mouth again, faint as winter's sun. Later, when she lay in the unfamiliar bed, she could hear him moving in the next room. Floorboards creaked under his weight. A chair scraped once, then silence. The ceiling above her was not the ceiling she knew. The house settled differently than the bakery. Even the night sounds had changed. No ticking oven, no scent of cooling bread, only wind around the eaves and the deep, low quiet of a place built by hands that understood endurance. The next morning she woke to the smell of coffee. She found Chayton in the kitchen before dawn, sleeves rolled, shoulders silvered by early light through the window. He had already banked the stove and set water to heat. He tilted his head toward the pot. "Take some." She poured a cup and nearly winced at the strength of it. Good Lord. It wakes you. It might also remove paint. He drank his without complaint. That, more than anything, told her what kind of man he was. When they stepped into the street together for the first time, as husband and wife conversations shifted around them like birds changing direction. No one said anything outright, not yet, but Cora could feel the looks. On the way to the bakery, Chaitan said quietly, "We walk back together tonight." She looked at him, to be seen, to be believed. She nodded. By noon, the town had already decided what kind of story it wanted to tell about them. But for the first time since the letter came, Cora felt the smallest thread of defiance pull tight inside her. Let them look. She had married for survival. She would survive this too. The first week of marriage was made of little collisions. Cora learned that Chaitan left before sunrise and moved through the kitchen with the silence of a man used to not being wanted in a room. He learned that she hummed under her breath while measuring flour and talked to dough as if it might listen better than people. He liked order. She spread ingredients everywhere like a storm crossing a table. He stacked tools by size. She left recipe pages open in 3 places at once. He made coffee black enough to frighten decent souls. She put cinnamon in hers when she could afford it and considered that proof of civilization. At night, they moved around each other with care, neither wanting to trespass, both too proud to admit the arrangement felt less simple than it had sounded in the bakery. Then market day came. Together, Cora said that morning, tying her bonnet strings tighter than needed. Chaitan nodded. Together. The square was already crowded when they arrived. Crates of apples, a pen of restless chickens, saddle leather lamp wicks, dried beans, bolts of calico catching light in faded colors. Dust rose under boots and drifted through wagon spokes like pale smoke. People noticed them at once. Cora felt it like heat against the skin. They stopped at a vegetable stand where Margot was examining onions with needless seriousness. "Well," Margot said without looking up, "you two have become a sight." "We came for carrots," Cora answered. "I am sure you did." Chaitan reached for a sack of potatoes. His face remained calm, but Cora could feel the tension in him the same way one feels a storm before thunder. Halfway across the market, she heard laughter from a knot of men near the hardware cart, not loud enough to repeat, not soft enough to ignore. Then Chaitan's hand settled at the small of her back. The touch was light, controlled, and brief. Still, it sent a sharp awareness through her that had nothing to do with the men watching. He left his hand there as they moved between the stalls, not possessive, not tender exactly, but deliberate. A shield made to look natural. Back in the house later, Cora set down a sack of flour more firmly than necessary. "That was unpleasant," she said. "Yes. You could say more than one word at a time, seeing as we are married." He looked up from putting away beans. "I was preventing trouble by looking like carved stone that is usually effective." Cora stared at him. To her surprise, his mouth twitched. It was a dry, quiet sort of humor there and gone. But it changed his face. "All right," she said. "Perhaps not entirely carved stone." That evening they ate later than usual. The wind had turned cooler, rattling the window latch over the sink. Chaitan brought in extra wood. Cora needed tomorrow's bread at the table because the bakery ovens needed one more repair she had not had time to face. He watched her hands for a while. "You put too much pressure there," he said. She looked up. "On dough," he nodded toward the heel of her palm. "You drive the air out." Cora blinked. "You know baking now, I know how skill looks. You are angry." She stared another moment, then laughed softly despite herself. "I am. At the market, at the law. The market. Men. Everything." He gave a small nod as if anger were a sensible tool when properly named. After a pause, he said, "You're better when you are angry than when you are afraid." The words startled her. Not because they were sweet. They were not. Chaitan did not seem built for sweetness in speech, but because they were observant, careful, true. "And you," she said, "going back to the dough, are kinder than this town deserves." He did not answer. Yet when she glanced up again, his face had gone still, in a different way, as though the sentence had found some hidden bruise. Days went by. They attended church once, sitting side by side beneath the suspicious gaze of half the congregation. Cora never went to services unless somebody was being buried or married. Chaitan seemed no fonder of it than she was. Still they stood, sang badly, and listened to Pastor Hale speak of covenant while dust motes turned in slanted morning light. By the end of the week, the town had adjusted to the sight of them together, though not without curiosity. At home, a strange thing was happening. The house no longer felt like borrowed shelter. Cora began setting out 2 cups without thinking. Chayton began leaving kindling cut to the exact size she liked for the stove. She knew which step on the porch groaned under his weight. He knew she forgot to eat when a batch went wrong and began bringing food to the bakery when that happened, setting it down with no speech and leaving before she could argue. None of it was romantic. That was what made it dangerous. It was practical, quiet, reliable. Like warmth gathering in winter before one notices the whole room has changed. The investigator came on a Monday morning when the cinnamon rolls were still warm and Cora had flour on her cheek. He was tall, narrow-faced, and dressed too neatly for the town with polished spectacles and the kind of careful manners that always hid meanness somewhere beneath. "Mrs. Crow," he said. The name struck her oddly every time she heard it. Yes, James Fletcher, Territorial Land Office. He showed a notebook rather than a badge, which somehow made him look even more official. Men with badges wanted obedience. Men with notebooks wanted weaknesses. "I am here to verify details pertaining to your recent marriage and associated property protections." Cora set down the tray in her hands. Verify routine in cases involving business ownership. Nothing about him felt routine. He asked when she and Chayton had begun courting, how they met, when she moved into his house, what time he woke, whether he returned home for supper, what books he read, whether he favored one side in sleep, how they divided chores. The questions grew smaller and sharper until they felt like awls pressing into seams. Cora answered carefully. Met at market. Private courtship. He rises before dawn. He reads by lamplight when work runs late. He eats whatever is set before him and does not complain. That last part was true enough. Fletcher wrote everything down with a thin scratch of pencil. At last he looked up. Some say the marriage was sudden. Some talk too much. He smiled without warmth. Perhaps. But fraud built around property concerns is not uncommon. Cora felt heat flare under her skin. There is no fraud here. Then you have nothing to worry about. He closed his notebook and left her with the worst kind of fear, the kind that pretends to be procedure. Cora shut the bakery early and crossed town fast, skirts in one hand. The hammering from the smithy stopped when she burst through the door. Chayton looked up from the anvil, took in her face and set the iron aside without a word. Fletcher came, she said, his expression flattened. Tell me. So she did. Every question, every look, every little trap disguised as routine. When she finished, Chayton wiped his hands on a rag and leaned against the workbench. Then we stopped guessing and start learning. Cora stared. Learning each other. That night, instead of eating in silence, they sat at the table with lamp flame trembling softly between them and began asking questions. Not the kind their false story required. The kind that left a mark. What was your mother like? Cora asked first. Chayton was quiet for so long she wondered if he would answer. Then he said, she sang when she worked, even in bad weather, especially then. The answer came low like something lifted carefully from deep water. Your father, I remember his hands better than his face. He made arrows straight enough to shame every other man in camp. Cora folded her fingers around her spoon. How old were you when you lost them? Too young to understand, old enough not to forget. The wind rubbed along the outside wall. The stove snapped once. When it was his turn, he asked, why baking? Cora looked down at her bowl. Because after my father died, the ovens were still there. The shop was still there. Bread made sense when grief did not. He nodded once, not pity, recognition. They went on. Favorite season, worst injury, things that wake you in the night, what you miss most, what you hate, what you would never surrender. Cora learned that Chayton read manuals and old histories because books of fact disappointed him less than books of men. That he hated waste of any kind. That thunder did not frighten him, but closed rooms did. He learned that she loved the scent of oranges because her father once brought home 3 in winter, and she had never forgotten such brightness in a hard season. That she was afraid of becoming dependent on anyone. That she still woke from dreams in which she could not get to her father's sickbed in time. At some point, they stopped doing it for Fletcher. The questions had become too real for that. When the dishes were cleared, Cora rubbed tiredness from her eyes. What if he comes back with something worse? Then we answer. What if he sees through us? Chayton looked at her across the table. Lamplight warmed the scar at his jaw and cast his eyes into deeper shadow. Then let him see that whatever this began, as he said, we are no longer strangers. Cora should have had an answer for that. Instead, she only looked at him, hearing the wind at the windows and the faint crackle of the banked stove, and understood with sudden clarity that danger had changed shape. It was not just the law now. It was the possibility that this arrangement might begin to matter too much. The second letter came at dusk. Chayton was waiting in the kitchen when Cora returned from the bakery, still wearing her apron, shoulders drooping with the honest exhaustion of work. He stood by the table with an opened envelope in his hand and a look on his face she had not seen before. Not anger, not quite. Something tighter, colder. "What is it?" she asked. He handed her the paper. "Further inquiry, residential inspection, verification of marital living arrangements." The words turned the air thick. When she asked, "Friday," Cora read the line again. "They are coming here. Yes, they will look at everything. Yes." Her heart began to beat harder. The house around her suddenly seemed full of evidence. 2 bedrooms, 2 routines. 2 separate lives only loosely braided at the edges. "They will see the rooms," she said. Chayton was already thinking ahead. She could tell by the stillness in him. "Then we give them 1 room to see." Cora looked up. "You mean yes?" The word landed between them like a coal. That night they remade the house. His shaving kit went onto her washstand. Her dresses moved into his wardrobe. His extra boots appeared near the bedroom door. They shifted books, folded blankets, hung both coats on the same peg, laid his hat beside her hairbrush on the dresser as though he had been doing so for months. By midnight, the house no longer looked divided. It looked lived in, shared, intimate in all the quiet practical ways the eye notices before the heart can defend itself. At last, they stood in the doorway of her room, now their room, staring at the bed. "It is not a large bed," Cora said. "No, that seems unfair. It was not built for fairness." She laughed once softly and without much mirth. "That sounds like something the law would say." He did not smile, but his eyes changed. "Sleep. We need our wits tomorrow." Yet sleep did not come easily. Cora changed in the washroom and came back in a plain nightdress with her braid loose down her back. Chayton had already set the lamp low. He stood by the window in shirt sleeves, broad shoulders cut in amber and shadow. For one strange second, neither moved. Then he crossed to the far side of the bed and lay down over the blanket as though approaching a skittish animal. Cora got in on her side, rigid as iron. The mattress dipped between them. Outside wind hissed through the dry weeds by the porch. The smithy, cooling after a long day, gave off occasional settling sounds through the wall like a creature breathing in sleep. "This is ridiculous," she said into the dark. "Yes, we are adults, so I have heard." She turned her face toward the wall, half annoyed, half grateful for the rough edge of his humor. Minutes passed, or an hour. The house quieted around them until all she could hear was the slow drag of wind and the measured sound of his breathing. At some point, the strain of wakefulness softened. When Cora opened her eyes again, dawn had laid a pale seam of light along the window frame. She was warm. That was her first thought. Warm in a way the room alone could not explain. Then she realized why. Sometime in the night, she had shifted backward and Chayton had moved toward her. His arm rested over her waist. Her back was against his chest. Their legs had drifted close beneath the blanket. His breath touched the loose hair at the nape of her neck in slow, even warmth. Cora went still. She should move. Instead, she lay there for one suspended heartbeat after another, aware of everything. The solid strength of his body, the quiet steadiness of him, the inexplicable safety of being held by someone who had not asked for the right yet had given comfort without force even in sleep. Behind her, his breathing changed. He was awake. Gently, very gently, his arm lifted away. "Morning," he said, voice rough with sleep. Morning, nothing else. They rose, dressed, drank coffee that neither tasted properly. The air between them was not awkward exactly. It was more dangerous than awkward. It was careful. At 10 sharp, the inspector arrived. Not Fletcher this time, but a severe woman named Mrs. Morrison, with graying hair, sharp eyes, and a clipboard carried like a weapon. She examined the house room by room, the hooks by the door, the mixed bookshelves, the mugs by the sink, the blankets folded at the end of the bed, the washstand with 2 brushes, 2 combs, a razor, hairpins. No detail escaped her. "You share this room?" she asked. "Yes," Cora said. "1 bed, yes." Morrison made a note. She questioned them separately. How many blankets did he prefer? Did she wake before him? Who banked the stove? Who mended clothing? Which side of the bed did each take? What did he eat when he could not sleep? What did she do when storms kept her awake? Cora answered as evenly as she could, clinging to truth wherever truth was available. Coffee before dawn. She steals the blanket when cold. He works with his hands when troubled. She rises early on baking days and late on Sundays if she can. When it was done, Morrison closed the clipboard. You will receive the office decision within 10 business days. Then she left, taking her polished boots, her hard eyes, and the fate of 2 lives with her. The door shut. Silence swelled in its wake. Cora looked at Chaitan. I cannot tell whether we passed. Neither can I. She turned toward the bedroom and stopped in the hall, struck by the sight of the open door, the made bed, the shape of a shared life still arranged there. One night in that bed had changed something she could not yet name. Not because they had done anything sinful or grand, because in sleep, when performance fell away, the body had chosen comfort where the heart had been refusing it. That frightened her more than the inspection had. The waiting that followed was its own kind of weather. Every day stretched too long. Every hoofbeat in the street made Cora look toward the window. Every folded paper in a courier's hand seemed like a threat from a distance. Yet while fear hung over them, life inside the house changed. Not all at once, quietly. The next morning, Chaitan was already at the stove when she came in, but this time he had left her cup near the warmer edge where coffee would not go cold. That evening, Cora found a loose hinge in the bakery repaired without being asked. The day after that, he came home with a small sack of oranges from a trader passing through. He set them on the table as if it were nothing. She stared. Where did you get these? You said once you liked them. That was all. Cora picked one up. The skin was bright as flame in her hands. For one wild second, she felt 12 again, standing in winter light, while her father split open a miracle. She looked at Chaitan. These cost money. Yes, you should not spend. I wanted to. No one had said words so simple to her in a very long time. She peeled one after supper. The scent filled the whole kitchen, clean and golden. Chaitan watched her smile over the first slice, as if that were payment enough. A few nights later, he tried to make eggs. Cora came in from washing up and found him standing over a pan of hopeless ruin. She stared. What have you done? They were meant to remain eggs. She put a hand over her mouth and laughed outright. The sound startled them both. Then he looked at her, truly looked, and something softened in his face that she had only glimpsed before. Move, she said, taking the pan. You are committing violence. He stepped aside obediently. She showed him low heat, patience, a gentler hand with the spoon. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her back. Outside, the night wind scraped softly along the porch boards. Inside, butter hissed in the pan, and the stove glowed red beneath the iron lid. Like this, she murmured. Seems slow. Good things usually are. When the eggs were done, they ate them with fresh bread and butter knees almost touching beneath the table. Neither moved away. The first kiss happened by accident. At least that was how Cora tried to name it. They were coming back from the bakery one windy evening with clouds boiling low over the plains. Dust stung the air. Her scarf came loose and whipped backward. Chaitan caught it before it could fly into the street. When he turned to hand it back, she was too close. His fingers brushed her jaw. Then his mouth found hers, not rough, not hesitant exactly, but as if some truth that had been waiting quietly between them had finally stepped forward. The kiss lasted only a breath and a half, enough to change the weather of the whole world. They pulled apart at the same time. Cora's pulse beat hard in her throat. That was not for show. No, you should say something more useful than one word. A shadow of a smile touched him. I wanted to do that. Her mouth still remembered the warmth of his. That is not especially useful either. But she did not step back. That night he kissed her again in the kitchen after supper, slower this time, one hand against the side of her neck, the other braced lightly on the table as if he were still making sure she had room to refuse. She did not refuse. From then on, tenderness began arriving in the house without needing to knock. A hand offered when she stepped over ice at dawn, his thumb brushing flour from her cheek. Her fingers tugging his collar straight before church and then lingering there, one heartbeat too long. Kisses before sleep, kisses in the pantry, kisses stolen in the strip of shadow between bakery and alley when no one was looking. Nothing reckless, nothing dishonorable, only a deepening. By the time the 10th day approached, Cora no longer thought of herself as enduring his house. She belonged to its sounds now. The scrape of his chair at supper, the groan of the porch step under his boot, the little crack of firewood settling after he stacked it beside the stove, and Chaitan, who had once seemed made entirely of distance and iron, had become part of the shape of every evening. One night, lying in the bed that had begun as a prop, he traced the inside of her wrist with a calloused thumb and said, When this is done, what would you do if no one could take the bakery? Cora thought about that. About dawns with no fear in them. About choosing a life instead of defending one. Keep baking, she said softly. Keep standing. Maybe rest for once. He nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. And you? He was quiet. Keep the smithy. Put my own name on it. Build things that last. Her chest tightened. You should. His hand closed gently over hers. Maybe. It was such a small word. But there was hope in it now. That made it sacred. The letter came on the 9th day. Cora was elbow deep in bread dough when the courier knocked. She signed for the envelope with flour still on her hands, shut the door and stared at the territorial seal until her vision blurred. She did not open it in the bakery. She carried it across town to the smithy where Chaitan stood at the forge with sparks lifting around him like angry stars. He saw the envelope and the hammer stopped mid-swing. Neither spoke for a moment. Then he stripped off one glove. Open it. Cora broke the seal with clumsy fingers. The words were dry, formal, merciless. After review of testimony and inspection, the office found evidence of fraudulent intent in the marriage of Cora Whitfield and Chaitan Crow. Associated property protections were suspended pending annulment unless appeal was filed within 14 days. Fraudulent intent. Her mouth went numb. Chaitan took the page and read it himself. The longer he looked, the more something shuttered behind his eyes. At last, he crushed the paper in his fist. They call us liars. Cora made herself answer. We were. That is not the point. He threw the letter across the room. It hit a tool chest and fell into the dirt. 3 years of labor, of swallowed insult, of fixing what other men neglected seemed to rise in him all at once like heat forced under iron. I built that place, he said, voice low and dangerous. I kept it standing. And some office clerk who has never held a hammer says I lose it because our marriage is not real enough for his liking. Cora's own anger had nowhere to go. It turned inward and cut. We can still appeal. With what? He turned on her then, not cruelly, but raw. What proof do we have? We barely knew each other before this. We shared a bed because the law demanded a performance. We built a lie and now the lie is collapsing. There is nothing real here for them to honor. The words struck hard. There is nothing real here. Silence followed. Not the kind they had begun to share comfortably. This was sharp and empty and final. Cora felt the hurt before she let herself feel the meaning. The kisses, the mornings, the oranges, the warmth in the dark. Had all of it meant more only to her? Of course that was foolish. Of course it was. This marriage had begun as a bargain. She had been the one to propose it. She had no right to bleed when the truth cut clean. Still she did. She bent once to pick up the crumpled letter, smoothed it out enough to fold, then set it on the bench. All right, she said. Chaitan looked at her, the anger in him not yet spent. Cora, you are right. The arrangement has failed. That is not what It is what you said. She removed the wedding band she had bought from a market stall for appearances, only thin brass warmed by months on her hand, and set it beside the letter. Tonight I will move my things back to the bakery. His face changed then, some piece of fury falling away too late. Wait. She drew herself upright. Her throat burned, but her voice did not. For what? More honesty then. She walked out before the shine in her eyes could disgrace her. The bakery was dim when she returned and colder than she remembered. She locked the door, went into the back room, and sat on the cot beneath the window with her father's recipe book in her lap. If the appeal failed, the bakery would be taken. If the appeal succeeded, what then? Return to a husband who had told her there was nothing real between them. She pressed a hand hard against her mouth. Outside wheels rattled on the road. Somewhere a dog barked twice and fell silent. The ovens had gone dark hours ago. In the little room behind the shop, grief came at her from 2 directions at once. Not just for the bakery, for the home she had not meant to grow into, for the man she had not meant to want. That night, she did not go back. Near midnight, she heard steps on the porch, then his voice through the door. Cora. She closed her eyes. Cora, I know you are in there. She said nothing. The door latch moved once gently, then silence. Then his voice again, lower now, closer, as if he had sat down outside with his back against the wood. I was angry, he said, and I said the worst thing I could have said. Cora pulled the blanket around herself tighter, but she could not shut out the sound of him. The marriage may have begun as a bargain, he said, but that is not all it became. Her heart thudded painfully once. Outside, the night wind moved softly along Main Street. Inside, she listened. For a long moment, Cora stayed where she was on the cot, staring at the door, as if the wood itself might answer for her. Chaitan's voice came again, stripped now of all reserve. When you first came to the smithy with that impossible offer, I thought only of the shop, of work, of survival. He paused. But you looked at me like I was a man worth making a plan with. Cora swallowed hard. No one had ever accused her of tenderness, yet somehow that quiet statement cut deeper than flattery ever could. I am tired, he went on, of being useful without being seen. Tired of building for other men while they decide what I'm permitted to keep. You were the first person in a very long time who spoke to me like I had a place in the future. Her hand drifted to the latch. These months with you, he said, stopped feeling like survival a while ago. The room had gone so quiet she could hear her own breathing. At least for me, he finished. And I think maybe for you too. Cora stood. She crossed the little room and laid her hand on the door palm flat to the wood. It was cold where the night touched it, warm where his body leaned against the other side. What are you asking? She whispered. That we fight. How I do not know yet. She let out one short, broken laugh. That is not encouraging. No. Despite everything, the honesty in that single word steadied her. She lifted the latch and opened the door. Chaitan sat on the porch step exactly as she had imagined, forearms on his knees, hat set beside him. He looked up with tired eyes and a face that had gone harder around the mouth from what the day had cost him. Moonlight silvered the scar along his jaw. Cora stood in the doorway with the blanket around her shoulders and felt the whole world narrow to that one worn step. You hurt me, she said. He nodded once. I know, and I do not forgive fast. I know. I may remind you of this years from now. That almost smile found him again, tired and faint. I expect you will. Then his expression sobered. But if we stop now, they win twice. They take the bakery, they take the smithy, and they take the one good thing that came out of this. Cora looked at him carefully. Say that plain. His gaze held hers. You. The night seemed to shift around them. No grand music, no lightning strike. Only the creak of the sign over the bakery door and the dry whisper of wind at the edge of the street. But in that moment, plain truth sounded larger than anything dramatic. She came out onto the porch. All right, she said. We fight, but not with another lie. He rose slowly. What do you mean we tell them the truth? Not every private thing, not what belongs only to us, but the truth. He waited. The marriage began as an arrangement, because the law was cruel and left us no honest path. She drew a breath. But somewhere in the middle of trying to survive it, we built something real. Chaitan studied her face, as though he hardly dared trust what he was hearing. You would say that before the appeals board? Yes. It may ruin us. We are already ruined if we stand there lying again. He considered that, then nodded. It is a terrible plan. It is. It may fail. Yes. A softer note entered his voice. It sounds like one of yours. That got a real smile out of her, small but unwilling to hide. They walked back to the smithy together under a moon as sharp and pale as hammered silver. Inside the house greeted her like something waiting. The banked stove, the dark table, the coat hooks by the door, her cup beside his. Home. The word slipped into her mind before she could stop it. Chaitan must have seen something change in her face because he said quietly, You do not have to share the room tonight. Cora looked toward the hallway. The bedroom had once been a performance, then an accident, then a place where she had learned the shape of safety in the dark. We have already spent 2 weeks in that bed, she said. It would be silly to grow shy now. His eyes warmed though his voice stayed low. Would it? Yes. He followed her to the doorway. Inside the room, she turned to him before the lamp was lowered. This time, she said, We are not doing it for an inspector. No. For fear. No. For appearances. He stepped closer. No. Her pulse beat hard but steady. Good. When he kissed her then, it was with none of the careful, borrowed quality of pretense. His hand cupped her face. Her fingers found the back of his neck. The kiss deepened slowly like fire taking to dry cedar, and all the loneliness of the past months seemed to lean toward that warmth. Later, lying together while the wind moved soft around the eaves, Cora rested her head against his shoulder and listened to his breathing. What if we lose? She asked into the dark. He turned and pressed his mouth to her hair. Then we start again, but not apart. It was not a promise of victory. It was better. It was a promise of endurance. The next 12 days moved with the strained intensity of people building a roof while the storm is already overhead. They gathered every paper they had: property notices, marriage records, tax receipts, deeds, inventory ledgers, bills of sale, letters from suppliers, notes showing what Cora had rebuilt in the bakery and what Chayton had restored in the smithy. It was not romance, but it was proof of labor, and labor had its own dignity. Each night they sat at the table after supper with lamplight pooled gold between them and worked through what they would say. Not a script, a spine. The law gave us no honorable choice. We chose survival. In surviving together, we made a life. We stand before you now not asking pardon for love, but justice against a law that tried to make honesty impossible. Cora said it better. Chayton said it plainer. Between them, the truth took on shape. And in the middle of all that grim preparation, tenderness continued to grow in stubborn little ways. He kissed her temple before leaving at dawn. She tucked biscuits into his coat pocket when he forgot breakfast. He mended the broken latch on the bakery window before she could ask. She sat in the smithy while he worked and read aloud from old newspapers when his leg troubled him too much for pacing. One afternoon, Fletcher came back. Cora knew something was wrong the moment the bell above the bakery door gave its sharp little chime, and she looked up into that narrow, polished face. He removed his hat with mocking courtesy. "Mrs. Crowe." She did not invite him farther in. "Mr. Fletcher, I heard you filed the appeal." "Yes." He glanced around the shop at the cooled pies, the rows of bread, the clean-swept floor. A foolish use of time. Cora folded her arms. "If you came to buy bread, choose some. If not, get out." His smile was thin as wire. "I came to save you embarrassment. Decisions such as these are rarely reversed. Then why do you care whether I try?" The question struck true. She saw it in the quick stillness of his face. At last he said, "Because systems fail when sentiment is allowed to govern them. A law is either enforced or it is not. And justice." He regarded her as though the word were decorative nonsense. Justice is a matter of lawful order. Cora stepped closer to the counter. "No, justice is what lawful order ought to answer to." He put his hat back on. "Pack your boxes, Mrs. Crowe. It will spare you grief." After he left, anger burned so clean through her that fear had no room to sit beside it. She went straight to the smithy. Chayton listened without interrupting, then laid down the file he had been reading. "He wants us tired," he said. "He wants us obedient. He will be disappointed." That evening, neither of them pretended bravery. The hearing was 2 days away. Their futures would be weighed by strangers. Every shared spoon, every kiss, every quiet repair, every hope of spring after this winter of law and lies, all of it stood on a threshold. Cora stood at the kitchen window after dark, looking at the black shape of the street. "I am afraid," she admitted. Chayton came up behind her, not crowding, only near. His hand settled over hers where it rested on the sill. "So am I." She turned to face him. "You do not sound like it." "That is because I learned young that fear is not improved by noise." She leaned her forehead briefly against his chest, and he held her without trying to solve what could not be solved tonight. "Tell me one thing true," she murmured. He tipped up her chin. "When this is over, whatever else happens, you will not face it alone." The words entered her like warmth after cold travel. That night when they lay together listening to the fire settle in the stove and the distant creak of sign chains in the windsleep came only in fragments. But every time she woke, his hand was still there. The appeals office sat in the county seat 2 towns over, a square brick building with whitewashed trim and windows too narrow to admit much mercy. Cora and Chayton rode in before dawn in a borrowed wagon that rattled over frozen ruts. The air cut sharp enough to sting the lungs. Their breath rose pale in front of them. The sky over the plains was still dark, with only a thin strip of silver far east where morning had begun to think about coming. Neither spoke much on the ride, not because there was nothing to say, because everything important had already been said in the nights before. When they arrived, the steps were crowded with men in coats and women with paperwork clutched to their chests. A smell of damp wool and coal smoke filled the vestibule. Inside the hearing room, 3 officials sat behind a raised desk. Fletcher stood to one side with a stack of files. Morrison was there as well, grave and unreadable. Cora felt Chayton's hand brush the back of hers once before they were called forward. A brief touch, steadying, not possessive. Their case was read aloud in flat administrative language. Marriage entered under suspicious timing. Associated business protections claimed. Interviews inconsistent. Intent possibly fraudulent. Each phrase sounded uglier than the last. At length, the chairman, a broad, older man with tired eyes, said, Mr. Crow. Mrs. Crow, you may respond. Cora and Chayton exchanged one glance. Then Cora stepped forward. We could lie again, she said, clear enough for every ear in the room. It would be easier, cleaner. You would perhaps even prefer it. But since this matter concerns whether our marriage is real, I do not see how another lie could help us prove anything worth keeping. A murmur moved through the room and died. The chairman lifted a hand. Proceed. Cora drew a breath. The marriage began as an arrangement. I owned a bakery I was about to lose because I was an unmarried woman. Mr. Crow had built the trade and goodwill of a smithy he could not legally secure without the proper standing. The law left us no decent path, so we took the indecent one. Fletcher's mouth tightened immediately. Admission of fraud is not a compelling defense. Chayton spoke, then his voice low but carrying. No, but the truth may be. He stepped beside her. We signed for survival, he said. That part is true. But we also lived the marriage after we signed it. We shared a house, labor, money, meals, worry, sleep, and the daily burden of one another's futures. If the question before you is whether what began falsely remained false, then the answer is no. One of the officials leaned forward. You ask us to believe necessity became affection. Cora met his gaze. No, sir, I ask you to believe that when two people are forced by unjust law into choosing one another for practical reasons, it does not make what grows between them less real. It may only mean the law arrived late to the truth. Silence followed. Then Fletcher rose. With respect, this is sentimental invention after the fact. The office investigator found reason to doubt them. The timing was convenient, the property benefits obvious. Their own admission confirms that the initial purpose was fraudulent. Morrison shifted slightly but said nothing. Chayton turned toward the desk, not toward Fletcher. I do not dispute the convenience. I dispute the assumption that convenience forbids truth from following. The chairman steepled his fingers. And what exactly do you seek from this board? Pity no, Cora said. Justice. The words seemed to settle differently in the room than before. She continued, if the law had allowed me to own what I built, I would not have needed to marry to save it. If the law had allowed him equal standing in the work he has done, he would not have needed me either. You call our first act fraudulent. Perhaps it was, but the greater fraud is a system that punishes honest labor until people are driven to desperate measures and then calls desperation immoral. A faint sound came from the benches behind them. Not quite approval, not quite surprise, something human. The chairman looked toward Morrison. Inspector, your findings. Morrison stood. My inspection found a shared household. Their answers were consistent in domestic detail. I reported unresolved concern regarding origin, not evidence sufficient to disprove present legitimacy. Fletcher turned sharply. That is not the tone of your written remarks. It is the truth of my testimony, she said. The room grew very still. The second official, a narrow woman with silver spectacles, addressed Cora. Mrs. Crow, if this board upholds the annulment, what then? Cora did not need to think. Then I lose my bakery, he loses his smithy, and I imagine we remain married in our hearts even if your paperwork prefers otherwise. The answer escaped before she could soften it. Heat rose into her face. Beside her, Chayton's shoulders changed with the smallest hidden breath. The silver-spectacled official looked at them both for a long moment. Then she said, and if we reverse it, Chayton answered, then you acknowledge that what people build with their hands and keep with their character is worth more than a suspicion born of timing. The board withdrew. Waiting for their return took longer than the ride, longer than the inspection, longer than the 9 terrible days between letter and loss. Cora sat with her hands locked in her lap until her knuckles blanched. Chayton stood near the window, still as timber, though she knew by the tightness in him that he was no calmer than she. At last the door opened. The board resumed their seats. The chairman cleared his throat. On review of testimony, documented labor interests, household evidence, and the insufficiency of proof that the present marriage lacks genuine standing, this board grants the appeal. The annulment is withdrawn. Property protections remain in force pending standard record transfer. For one bright, empty second, Cora heard nothing at all. Then the words reached her. Granted, withdrawn, remain in force. She turned toward Chayton so fast her chair scraped the floor. His eyes were on her, dark and stunned and alive with something she had only seen there in fragments before. Relief, wonder, love plain enough now that it no longer needed caution. Fletcher looked as if he had bitten iron. Cora did not spare him another glance. Outside the building, the winter sun had broken fully over the plains, pouring cold gold across the steps. She laughed, then a breathless, unbelieving sound, and Chayton caught her around the waist before she could even think about who might be watching. He kissed her there in daylight and law and open air, with wagons rattling in the yard below and smoke climbing from chimneys across town. This time, there was no audience that mattered, only the truth. They rode back to Cold Creek with the appeal papers tucked inside Chayton's coat, and the whole wide afternoon shining hard and clear around them. The wind was cold, but it no longer felt like punishment. It felt like weather, ordinary weather, a thing to be lived through, not feared as omen. By the time they reached town, the shadows had begun to lengthen. The bakery windows glowed amber from the lamps Cora had left low. Smoke rose from the smithy chimney. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and children shouted near the pump. Life, simple and ongoing. Margot was the first to see them. She came out of the boarding house with her shawl half fastened and one eyebrow already climbing. Well, Cora held up the folded order. Margot snatched it, skimmed, then let out a bark of laughter bright enough to turn heads clear across the street. You stubborn, glorious fools! Within an hour, the town knew. By supper, 3 ranch hands had come by the smithy with work they suddenly insisted could wait for Chayton alone. Mrs. Bell from the dry goods store sent over a jar of preserves as if she had supported them all along. Even Pastor Hale found a reason to pass the bakery and remarked that perseverance was often rewarded. Cora accepted every kindness with calm she did not entirely feel. She understood now that towns were like fires. They leaned whichever way the wind took them. That night, after the lamps were out in the bakery and the forge was finally dark, Cora stood in the kitchen of the house she no longer doubted was hers too. A loaf cooled on the table. Chayton had left his gloves by the door. Her shawl hung beside his coat. The oranges were gone, but the bowls still carried their faint, clean scent if she leaned close enough. He came in from the porch where he had just checked the latch against the wind. All secure, she asked. Yes. The house was quiet. Only the soft tick of cooling stove iron and the far-off whisper of wind over the road. Cora looked at him for a long moment. You know, she said this all began because I was too stubborn to let the law steal my bakery. Chayton stepped closer, and I was too stubborn to let anyone steal my smithy. So we built a marriage out of sheer refusal. His eyes warmed. That sounds right. She folded her arms loosely. It is not especially romantic. No, not the sort of beginning girls dream of. Were you ever that sort of girl? Cora smiled. Never. He reached out and brushed flour from the edge of her sleeve, though there was almost none there. It was an old habit now, familiar as breathing. What would suit you better? He asked. She considered, then answered honestly, not a beginning, a continuation. He seemed to understand at once. From his pocket he drew the thin brass ring she had left on the bench the day of the letter. He had kept it. He took her hand and placed the ring in her palm. We were married by fear, he said, then by need, then by truth. His voice lowered. I would like, if you will have it, to be married now by choice. Cora looked down at the little ring resting on her skin. Cheap brass. Bought for appearance, nearly discarded with a lie. It had no beauty of its own, but it had endured, like them. She closed her fingers around it and felt tears threaten before she let them. You are not good at pretty speeches, she said softly. No, but that was a fine one. I worked on it. She laughed through the wetness in her eyes. I can tell. Then she slid the ring back onto her finger and rose on her toes to kiss him. Slowly, fully, with no fear in it. When they parted, her forehead rested against his. Yes, she whispered. I will have you. Not for 60 days. His hand spread warm against her back. For how long then? She looked toward the table, the lamp, the dark hallway leading to the room they had once staged and now truly shared. She thought of pre-dawn coffee, warm bread, hammer blows, ringing into open-air winter, giving way at last to spring. Forever, she said. He kissed her again, as if the word itself deserved sealing. Later, beneath heavy quilts, while the wind moved gently outside and the fire settled in the stove with little crackling sighs, Cora lay with her head on his chest and listened to the slow, strong beat of his heart. The bakery was safe. The smithy was his. The law had not become good. The world had not become kind. But within 4 wooden walls, at the edge of a frontier town, mercy had taken human shape anyway. In the morning she would rise before dawn, tie on her apron, and go knead bread in the dark, warm kitchen of the bakery she had fought to keep. He would bank the coals, pull on his gloves, and cross to the smithy where iron waited for his hands. And at night they would come back to the same table, the same bed, the same hard-won peace. Not because survival required it, because love did. If this story stayed with you, leave a quiet word in the comments and tell me where you are listening from tonight.
And if you believe even a brutal world cannot break what mercy protects, stay for the next story.